And if Mr. Currie calls in question the truth of what is asserted, he is the first of the Presbyterian denomination, so far as I know, that has alleged the above principles were not espoused by the Church of Scotland ever since our Reformation. But Mr. Currie, that he may fix an untruth upon the testimony, adds, quote, "If a papist hath been set upon the throne by the people, they having sworn allegiance to him, he ruling according to law, and defending the subjects and their rights and privileges, sacred and civil, he must be a lawful and rightful king, according to the doctrine taught in our Confession, chapter 23, article 4, unquote. Though I humbly judge the words of the Presbytery's Act do not determine in the question as stated above by Mr. Currie, yet he appears to me to pervert the words of our Confession. The words of the Confession are, infidelity, or difference in religion, doth not make void the magistrate's just and legal authority. But according to our principles received immediately after the Reformation, when Queen Mary abdicated the crown, as also according to the principles which were espoused by the three nations at the Revolution, one that is a professed papist can never have a just and legal authority. Consequently, it is nowise contrary to our confession of faith to assert that a professed papist cannot be a lawful nor rightful king in these realms, even though all Mr. Currie's ifs should be taken in. And I know not but some of our moderate Jacobites would desire the popish pretender only upon such conditions as are above mentioned by Mr. Currie. I have not the least suspicion that Mr. Currie is of Jacobite principles, but I pray and hope that the Lord shall preserve these lands from having a papist upon the throne, even though he should swear the coronation oath. I do not think any that know the principles of papists can reckon their liberties sacred or civil to be safe under the government of a papist. And therefore, if Mr. Currie had pleased, he might have spared his above ifs and conditions anent a papist being set upon the throne. I know not what good purpose or end he intends to promote by them. Seventhly, according to Mr. Currie, 'tis neither a truth nor matter of fact when it is asserted, Act and Testimony, page 39, quote, that our Parliament immediately after the Revolution did appoint the oath of allegiance to be sworn in place of any other oaths imposed by laws and acts of preceding Parliaments, unquote. But 'tis truth and matter of fact that the oath of allegiance at first and the oath of abjuration afterwards are both substitute in the place and room of our solemn covenants, which in our reforming times were reckoned a protest of allegiance to the sovereign. And this I judge is all that is intended by the words of the Presbytery in their Act and Testimony. I shall leave the reader to what I have said upon this defense, page 319, which, if he pleases, he may compare with Mr. Currie's reply, Vindication, page 315. Eighthly, says Mr. Currie, 'tis not fact when it is asserted, Act and Testimony, page 40, that it was the laudable practice in reforming times to condemn all steps of defection. To prove that this is not fact, Mr. Currie mentioned some things that were not condemned by the Assembly 1638, and amongst others the supremacy. To which I answer that the acts of that Assembly against prelacy, and the 5 Articles of Perth, and against all civil places and power of kirkmen, were a condemnation of former steps of defection, and also the act against the High Commission Court, and the act concerning yearly General Assemblies, were acts that condemned the supremacy. Ninthly, says Mr. Currie, it is not matter of fact, when in the same, page 40, it is affirmed, that in former reforming times it was their laudable practice to censure such as were guilty of public backsliding. This the Presbytery proved by the acts that were passed censuring all the bishops in the year 1638 who were the ringleaders in the apostasy. The Presbytery never assert that every individual who is involved in the guilt of defection and backsliding was censured, but restrict their assertion unto the prelates who were ringleaders in the apostasy. And if Mr. Currie pleases to look to the Latin history entitled Historia Matum, he'll get several instances of censures inflicted upon others who were active in carrying on the course of defection. Tenthly, Mr. Currie says, it is not truth to say that the Assembly 1638 deposed all the bishops, for that Assembly only suspended 2 of them. To which I reply that the Presbytery in their Act and Testimony speak according to the title prefixed to the several acts passed against the bishops, and I refer the reader to what I have further observed upon this head in the defense, page 320. 11th, Mr. Currie further alleges that it is not fact which is said, Act and Testimony, page 40, quote, that in the reforming period they returned to the Lord by a particular acknowledgement and confession of the sins of the ministry and of the whole land, unquote. And why is this not fact? Quote, for, says Mr. Currie, in all that period we have no particular acknowledgement of the sins of the ministry and complying with prelacy, etc., unquote. To prove the truth of what is asserted by the Presbytery, I refer the reader to the historical account which I give in the defense of what passed in the year 1638, particularly to the Assembly's letter 1640, directed to the churches of Helvetica, a part of which is insert in the defense, page 237. And to the other instances I give of deep humiliation and mourning upon the renovation of the National Covenant, defense, page 241 and 242, as also to the speech delivered by the moderator of the Assembly, 1638, narrated, the defense, page 255 and 256. I shall not pursue Mr. Currie further in his exceptions against the Act and Testimony till he make the above particular condescension which I have craved and demanded. It is like Mr. Currie may tell his reader in his next book, that his exceptions against the Act and Testimony, which I have not touched, are unanswerable, and that they are, as he speaks, puzzling. But they appear to me as trifling and as easily answered. As these I have above condescended upon, and I doubt not that such who are truly concerned with the state of matters in the Church of Scotland at this time, and who are willing to join the Associate Presbytery in the confession that they make of our received principles in opposition to the manifest injuries that have been done them, and the deviations that have been made from them. I doubt not, I say, that such will be in no strait and difficulty about declaring their conjunction with the Associate Presbytery upon the footing of their Judicial Act and Testimony, notwithstanding of the exceptions that Mr. Currie makes unto it, providing they consider the same with judgment and without prejudice and bias. I shall close this chapter with an observe, which Mr. Currie makes, Vindication, page 85, quote, I know not, for my part, who can express themselves with so much caution, but sometimes these who are fond to animadvert upon the words of others and are critical may find a handle to grip at, unquote. Chapter 6. Wherein some lax principles are instanced which are advanced by Mr. Currie either in his essay or vindication. I have alleged sometimes in the defense that Mr. Currie has vented in his essay some principles concerning church communion which I judge to be lax. Mr. Currie thinks fit in his vindication to return the charge with an accusation of several anti-Reformation principles which he alleges are asserted in the defense. I shall briefly consider the anti-Reformation principles he charges me with, and then I shall give some particular instances to show that I have still ground to accuse him of laxness in principle upon the subject of church communion. The first anti-Reformation principle charged is laid in the following terms. Vindication, page 4, quote, It is an anti-Reformation principle to assert with our brethren that people ought to separate from any church like the Church of Scotland, unquote. But as this is a begging the whole of what is in question betwixt Mr. Currie and the Associate Presbytery, so I reckon I have equal ground to charge him with the following anti-Reformation principle. That is it is warrantable for us, yea, that we are obliged in duty to continue in ecclesiastical communion with the Church, when in her ecclesiastical capacity she departs from Reformation once attained unto, and justifies herself in her defections and backslidings, persecuting and casting out of her communion such as endeavor to testify and bear witness against her defections and backslidings, when she is, in these and the like particular instances, breaking asunder the external bonds and ligaments of ecclesiastical union and communion amongst all her members. This I take to be a principle that runs through the whole of Mr. Currie's essay and vindication, and it appears to me to be an anti-Reformation principle, that is, a principle aversive of that principle upon which our secession from Rome was stated, and a principle directly opposite to the characters of a true church as they are laid down in our Reformed confessions of faith. A second anti-Reformation principle he charges me and all the seceding brethren with is in the Vindication, page 32, where he says, The author of the offense and all the brethren again and again harp upon this, that the Church of Scotland hath kept in ministerial communion with them one who had derogate from the essential glory of the Son of God. He adds that if he is not far mistaken, the brethren will be very hard put to it to find a scripture for founding a sentence of excommunication against Professor Simpson, considering what repentance he professed before the assembly. And then he subjoins, Here the Reverend Mr. Wilson, in his pretended defense of our Reformation principles, defends another anti-Reformation principle, which, says he, appears from the first and second book of Discipline, where the obstinate are only to be excommunicated. Mr. Currie also gives the judgment of this church in her directory for church government and church censures, as also the judgment of some godly and able ministers, such as Masters Gillespie, Burroughs, etc., who all declare the impenitent and obstinate are only to be excommunicated. But according to Mr. Currie, Mr. Simpson was a penitent, and therefore Mr. Wilson and the rest of the brethren are guilty of an anti-Reformation principle when they have affirmed that such a penitent as Mr. Simpson was should have been excommunicated. To which I briefly answer that the Reverend Principal Mr. Hadow, in his preface to his Enquiry, page 9, which I have quoted already in this continuation, exculpates Mr. Wilson and all the brethren of the charge that Mr. Currie has laid against them when he asserts that Mr. Simpson understands his several declarations made before the assembly in a sense consistent with his former papers and does not ingenuously retract his arrant tenets there invented. And here we have another lax or anti-Reformation principle maintained by the Reverend Mr. Currie in his pretended vindication of the real Reformation principles of the Church of Scotland. That is, that the present judicatories did right in holding one in ministerial and Christian communion with them who had derogate from the essential glory of the Son of God, and who had never made an ingenuous retraction of the Arian tenets which he had vented in several papers during the dependence of his process against him. Mr. Currie charges several erroneous principles upon me on the question between him and me, whether or not intruders should be received and acknowledged in the church as her lawful and sent ministers. Vindication, chapter 5, section 3. But I have considered and answered his accusations upon this head, chapter 3, section 3 of this continuation, to which I refer the reader. I shall only in this chapter give a few instances of some of Mr. Currie's principles which appear to me to be lax principles, and the most of them are such upon which he supports his argument for conjunction with the present judicatories and against secession from them. Some of Mr. Currie's lax principles are contained in his answers that he makes to an argument for secession from the present judicatories, as it is stated by Mr. Ebenezer Erskine in his preface to Mr. Guthrie's last sermon, page 7. The words are, quote, "When the reformation of corruptions and the purging out of evident scandals is the only condition demanded, what can be the reason that it is not granted? One of the two it must needs be, that is, either because the judicatories will not, or else because they cannot reform. If it be because they will not, they are not to be withdrawn from as wicked. If it be because they cannot, or want power, it says the key of discipline is taken from them, and that they are not Christ's officers and stewards," unquote. Mr. Currie alleges that I argue much to the same purpose when, in the defense preface, page 7, I say, quote, "What reason can be given why the present judicatories refuse to discharge their duty in lifting up the judicial testimony for truth, or why they refuse to set about Reformation work? There must be one of two. I cannot conceive a midst between them. Either they will not, or they are hindered to discharge their duty by some outward force and violence upon them. I hope the last cannot be alleged, therefore no other reason can be given for the conduct of the judicatories, but that they are obstinate in their course and way, and will not reform," unquote. Mr. Currie alleges in the Vindication, page 349, quote, "that if he is not far mistaken, the horns of the above dilemma are so broken that it can neither pierce, draw blood of, nor do the least hurt unto his essay on separation," unquote. Let us then inquire how Mr. Currie has broken the horns of dilemma. He alleges in the Vindication, page 14, that it contains, quote, "corrupt doctrine and an error of a dangerous nature," unquote. But how does Mr. Currie instruct this? For, says he, Reformation must be refused by judicatories when they are neither weak nor wicked, but perhaps blind or ignorant, or cannot see the evil of what is complained of, unquote. But if a church is blind or ignorant, then I affirm she is both weak and wicked, unless Mr. Currie can allege that sufficient means of intrusion are not given her. And if he says so, he reflects upon the Holy Scriptures, as if they were not a sufficient and clear light for directing the judicatories of a church at all times and in all cases to their duty. Besides, the above doctrine taught by Mr. Currie is both corrupt and dangerous in regard. He doth upon the matter affirm that a church which refuseth Reformation is not to be departed from, if her obstinacy proceeds from her blindness or ignorance, and this I look upon to be a lax principle. And truly at this rate the Church of Rome is not to be departed from, because it may be alleged that perhaps she is blind or ignorant and cannot see the evil of what is complained of.